138 openings of wisdom. This is opening 26. The English gematria words for today are Joshua, Israel. In English gematria, Joshua, Israel equals 138. Joshua equals 74, and Israel equals 64. This is opening 26, details of the residue that filled the empty space. This emanated light was called a residue of the primordial light, which, because of its supreme greatness, could not be apprehended. This residue is called the place, or space, of all that exists, because this is what gives them existence, which the aspect of limitlessness would not give them. This place or space is said to be empty, and it is void of the light of Ein Sof, blessed be He, in the sense that His limitlessness is not found there as at first. Having explained that as a result of the Tzimtzum, a new light emerged. We must now understand further details about this light. The proposition has three parts. Part 1, this emanated light. This explains that the emanated light was only a trace of the first light that disappeared. Part 2, this residue is called. This explains that this emanated light has the power to provide a place or space for all that exists. Part 3. This place or space is said to be empty. This explains the concept of emptiness as it applies to this place. Part 1. The light that was emanated was called a residue. It was called a residue, but only until new developments took place in it. This is because different names and descriptions are given to the lights according to their different functions. And the very light with which we are presently calling the residue will later be called worlds, buildings, structures, and various other names. However, before we trace these later developments, we shall refer to it by the term that applied to it originally, when it was called the residue. It was called the residue even though this term does not fit completely. This is because a residue is a trace left over from something that is in the same category, only greater. While the remaining trace is less. However, in the case in hand, the light that disappeared was not visible light, while the light that remained is visible light. Just to pause for a moment, just to reflect on this, that it seems that the greater light, the paradox for us is that the greater light is not visible, while the light that's visible is actually the lesser light. And by analogy, we can see that this world, which seems more concrete, and we think this is the real world, and everything that happens here is real, is actually less real than the less tangible world in some respects. And yet, it is said that this material world is where God desires to dwell in. And that's the paradox. Which is higher, this world or that world? If that world is higher, then why does God want to dwell here? And that's just my reflection on that. That perhaps that's the idea. God wants to dwell here because it's so different than Him. It's outside of Him, and yet He's here. but in truth, that is more of a real, if you want to call it real, according to what the Ramchal is writing here. At any rate, let's continue. Thus, they are not in the same category, and the light that remained is not exactly a residue of the infinite light. We cannot truly say that it is a residue of that light, only that it is called a residue. As to why it is so called, if it is not really a residue, you will see later. A residue of the primordial light, this indicates that the light that remained was not new and different from the light that disappeared, but rather that it was like a small part of it. Prior to the act of Tzimtzum, it was not recognizable as something separate in itself, but after the Tzimtzum it could be recognized as such. We will be able to gain a deeper understanding of this entire matter by considering the relationship between Malchut and the other Sefirot as found in the lower realms from Atzilut downwards. In other words, the relationship between Malchut and the other Sefirot as found in the world of Atzilut and below will provide an analogy through which we may understand the relationship between the residue and, see, that seems like a good word to know, residue. Residue is 81, and the residue is 114. Okay, good to know, good to know. Let's go back here. Where were we? Yeah. The residue and the departed primordial light of Ein Sof. This is because the residue is called Malchut of Ein Sof. Let us first consider the analogous case. Malchut is the root of the created worlds and their inhabitants. And what is Malchut? Malchut is the last part of the Sefirot of Zeir Anpin. The last, meaning the last part of all the Sefirot making up the Partzuf of Zeir Anpin, which is Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, representing all of the upper Sefirot. Each of the upper Sefirot includes all 10 Sefirot and therefore has its own individual Malchut. For the root of the lower realms and beings is the last part, the last power found in each individual Sefirah. Now, we may object. If so, this would imply that the lower realms have 10 roots, these being the 10 last parts of all 10 Sefirot, not just one root in the overall Malchut. The answer to this is that the law that the lower creatures should exist is called Malchut, the overall Malchut. This is a bond of all the powers contained in the 10 Sefirot to bring forth the lower realms. For each Sefirah contains a power that relates to bringing forth the lower realms and beings. And this is its individual Malchut, such as Malchut of Chesed, Malchut of Gevurah. The overall Malchut is the law that lower realms should exist. And from what is this law or light constructed? It consists of the totality of the powers consisting in each of the individual Sefirot to bring forth the lower realms. In other words, the overall Malchut is a bond of all the individual Malchuyot of each of the 10 Sefirot. Even so, these separate powers would be hanging in suspense, but for one general overall law which they need, namely, that the lower realms should exist. This law, or power, the overall Malchut includes these specific powers, the individual Malchuyot of each of the 10 Sefirot. This is what makes the potential actual. The bond of all these powers contained in each of the individual Sefirot to bring forth the lower realms is the law called Malchut. Having understood the analogous case, the relationship between Malchut and the higher Sefirot as manifested in the realms below, let us now apply this understanding to the subject of our present discussion, the upper level, the relationship between the residue and the departed light of Ein Sof. For all that remains revealed after the Tzimtzum is spoken of as Malchut of Ein Sof. In other words, all that departed, leaving only the specific power to create independent worlds and beings, may be considered parallel to the 9 upper Sefirot as manifested in the lower realms. On the other hand, what remains after the Tzimtzum, created worlds and beings existing within bounds and limits, may be considered parallel to the Malchuyot of these 9 Sefirot. And what is Malchut? The overall Malchut is the bond of all the powers found in the individual Sefirot to bring forth the lower worlds. Malchut is the general law that all the Sefirot should bring forth the lower realms and beings according to what is rooted within them. We therefore call this light that is revealed in the residue after the Tzimtzum Malchut, and we say that it is like the last part of all that departed, which we have compared to the 9 higher Sefirot. Accordingly, we call it a residue of all that departed. We must distinguish between 2 aspects here, the bond of these parts, namely the law that the lower realms should exist, this being the overall Malchut in its proper place. We will term the place or space of the lower realms. This is the power that gives a place for their existence. But inasmuch as the overall Malchut is built of the residue of all that departed and includes the power contained in each Sephirah to bring forth the lower realms, we can term this the actual root of the lower realms. These 2 aspects are also found in Malchut below, for Malchut is a place or space in the sense of providing the possibility for lower realms to exist. In addition to this, Malchut itself is also the individual root of each one of them, because the overall Malchut includes all the individual Malchuyot of all the other Sefirot, which, because of its supreme greatness, could not be apprehended here, is the reason why we may call this a residue, even though it is not strictly in the same category as the light of Ein Sof, which cannot be seen. While the light of the residue has an end and a limit can be seen, the reason is because there is a way in which they can be considered to come under one category. Since we have called Ein Sof, blessed be He, simple light, and the light of the residue is also light. If so, they both come into the category of light, even though the one cannot be seen while the other is visible light. For we may consider the ability to be seen a contingent occurrence in the residue that could not apply to the first light. This is supported by the point made earlier in opening 5 that even in the case of the Sefirot, the ability to be seen is not intrinsic to their nature but was willfully instituted. He wanted the minimal power that constitutes the realm of limits and boundaries to be visible, while that which is beyond limits he did not want to be visible. Accordingly, we apply the word residue to the limited power subsumed within his limitless power. The Supreme Will wanted that his limited power should be capable of being seen. So here, if I understand correctly, just to review, when it says the Supreme Will has limited power, this is a will of the Supreme Will. This is an expression of his will that he will have limited power in addition to unlimited power. He actually created a space for him to have limited power, as it were. Limited power in addition to his unlimited power. So this line he says here, the Supreme Will wanted to have this limited power to be capable of being seen. Just my own understanding of this, we cannot fathom God's unlimited power. We can maybe imagine, if we stretch our imagination as much as possible, to think of anything that could possibly be, would be within God's unlimited power and more than we can imagine. It's hard to start to say that you can't imagine, but there are boundaries to our own imagination. Even if we think we have the greatest imagination, we can imagine anything, there's still more that we can't imagine. I can't prove this, but I would think that that's reasonable. I would think that there's things that I can't imagine, or any other human being. And God's power goes beyond that, but we can't fathom that. But we can fathom a power that's limited. And that's how I understand the Ramchal's saying here. One could object, firstly, how can we say that what departed was 9 Sefirot? Surely the Sefirot are limited, whereas what departed is without limits, and if so, cannot be considered in the category of 9 Sefirot. Further, the 9 Sefirot are 9 separate functions, whereas in the case of the unlimited, it is impossible to speak of separate parts. If so, what departed was not 9 Sefirot, for you cannot just ascribe parts to the unlimited. Clearly, there is no difference between one part and another, except in virtue of the boundary that divides between them. Whereas on the level of the unlimited, the concept of boundary is not applicable in any way, and if so, it is impossible to speak of parts. Now, taking this as a premise, part in Hebrew is chelek, chet lamed kuf, which has a numerical value of 138. And he's saying that the most sublime aspect of God has no parts. But the word Ben Elohim, Son of God, is gematria chelek, part. So in gematria, Son of God is differentiated from Elohim. So is Ben Elohim, and how is it connected to this non-part entity? if it has the gematria part, and it also has the gematria of tzemach, which is plant, and tzemach is referred to unanimously as the Messiah. And so the Messiah could be paradoxical in that he's both a part and a non-part at the same time. But that's just a pondering. But at any rate, let's continue. These objections may be answered as follows. Just going back to the Genesis, and Midrashim say that Ruach Elohim merachef al pnei hamayim ze Ruach HaMashiach. Ze Ruach Shel Mashiach. So the Messiah's energy is there. So how is that connected to the Ein Sof? Is it the Ein Sof or is it not the Ein Sof? That's the big question. That's the $64 trillion question. These objections may be answered as follows. It is true that the Sefirot are limited, while that which departed is without limits. And from this side, we should not have compared what departed to the Sefirot. It is impossible to compare what departed, which is without limits, to these parts that remained, which fall within the category of limitation. Nevertheless, the 9 Sefirot, although limited, do still give an indication of the unlimited, while Malchut is actually on the boundary. For the root of the matter is that the limited functions necessary for the entire existence of created realms and beings are, in truth, 9 parts, which constitute the structure of Malchut itself. This is the pathway, limitation, and boundaries that have been subsumed within Ein Sof, as discussed earlier in opening 24. However, the unlimited overwhelmed each of these 9, bringing them back beyond limits. Therefore, we find here 10 Sefirot, 9 levels of limited action. For example, Malchut of each individual Sefirah, Malchut of Chesed, Malchut of Gvura, etc., all having one objective and all considered as constituting one Sefirah, the overall Malchut. The sway which the unlimited has over each of them is considered as the other 9 Sefirot, Chesed of Chesed, Gvura of Chesed, etc. And so too the case of every Sefirah, with the exception of Malchut of each one. From their side, they are not divided, for the unlimited holds sway over every part of the pathway of limitation and boundaries, bringing it back beyond limitation, inasmuch as the unlimited holds sway over these 9 Sefirot, bringing them back beyond limitation. They are spoken of as the 9 Sefirot of Ein Sof, but not on account of what they are in themselves. However, the Sefirot after the Tzimtzum are all parts of Malchut. After the Tzimtzum, we are speaking of the 9 Sefirot only from the aspect of their Malchut, and accordingly, they are all limited. The Malchut of each of the individual Sefirot is the pathway of limitation and boundaries that was subsumed in Ein Sof as a hypothetical possibility prior to Tzimtzum, while the upper 9 Sefirot of each individual Sefirah indicate the unlimited who holds sway over the pathway of limitation. They are not the unlimited in himself, but give enough indication of him as is necessary for the sake of the government, as will be explained in its proper place. Part 2. This residue, the existence of this residue depends upon the bond of all the individual Malchuyot of the 9 higher Sefirot, this being the law that the lower realms should exist. Malchut, the 10th law of the 10 laws constituted by the 10 Sefirot. Accordingly, the bond of the last, the bottommost powers contained in the unlimited, which joined together to make the residue in this way, is the overall Malchut. This is the place of the created realms and beings, for this is the law that gives them existence. The residue itself is made up of these powers that were joined together, these being the root of the lower realms as below. It's called the place of all that exists, because this is what gives them the ability to exist, which the aspect of limitlessness did not give them. It is called a place or space inasmuch as it fulfills the function of a place or space, which contains that which stands within it. However, it is not a place in the physical sense of being an actual place containing whatever stands within it, for the concept of physical space is not applicable to the Sefirot, since they are godliness, and in godliness there are no physical accidents. Part 3, this place is said to be empty, halal, literally hollow, in the sense that it serves as a container to hold others. It is a particular level whose essence is such that it needs others to exist. It depends upon it, like a space waiting to be built up, which is empty as long as it is not filled with buildings. Since the essence of Malchut is to establish worlds, to exist dependent upon it like branches, we say metaphorically that it has a container. And as long as only this level existed and the worlds did not exist, we say that the container was hollow and empty. As soon as the worlds dependent upon it exist, we say that its hollow is full. Indeed, as long as the unlimited held sway, everything was completely perfect. As soon as the unlimited departed, Malchut was revealed as a container. But initially it was not revealed as being filled with all its worlds, but rather as an empty space. Nevertheless, it was not completely hollow, for the root of the worlds that were destined to emerge was present in the form of the residue, except that the residue was like air, in the sense that the worlds were not discernible. Accordingly, even though its container was full of air, as it is called hollow in relation to Ein Sof, blessed be He. For initially, prior to the Tzimtzum, there was no need for any further perfection. And even after the Tzimtzum, the encompassing Ein Sof lacks no perfection whatever. That which is still in need of perfection is called hollow, meaning lacking in perfection in relation to the perfection of Ein Sof. We therefore say that afterwards, when the line came down and made the residue into Sefirot, we say that it filled this hollow. This is why the Kabbalistic sages said that the line, the Kav, filled the hollow. I think it's the Kav. He doesn't say that, but I think the line is the Kav. Filled the hollow, and the entire hollow space was filled with the 10 Sefirot of Adam Kadmon. Eitz Chaim 1:4. It could be objected, what need is there to say that it is called hollow in relation to Ein Sof? Should we not say it is called hollow because it is still in need of perfection? The answer is, inasmuch as the container was at that time filled with the residue, it should not have been called hollow. However, in relation to the encompassing Ein Sof, blessed be He, who is perfect in every way, and to whom the concept of further perfection is not applicable, it is called hollow. It is also called hollow relative to what it was when filled with the unlimited which departed from it. And it is empty in the light of Ein Sof, blessed be He, in the sense that His limitlessness. I'm going to pause for reflection here, and I'll mention it. During this time, after I pass a certain amount of minutes, I've entered this space where I can reflect upon the Brit Chadashah in relation to Kabbalistic ideas and in relation to the thesis that Ramchal is putting forth, in that in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, it's written that taking the form of a son or something, I'm not sure, but basically he learned obedience. And that doesn't, I've always had a question with that. If this is a perfect individual, the Messiah, how does he learn obedience? We're talking about a perfect individual. Doesn't need to learn anything. Unless the Greek had something different. And so, unless you're saying that the Messiah is not this Ein Sof, he comes from the Ein Sof. He's not this perfect in the same way. He might be perfect, but not in the same way of the Ein Sof. This is an open question that continues to come forth, and as I bear them out here, they're recorded, and maybe it can come up at a future time. At least they're recorded as of now. And it is okay. It is also called a hollow relative to what it was, and filled with the unlimited which departed from it. And it is empty of the light of Ein Sof, blessed be He, in the sense that His limitlessness is not found there as at first. This explains why the worlds can exist on this level in the hollow of which we are speaking, because the unlimited, which would otherwise not permit the existence of separate levels, is not found there after the Tzimtzum. The way this appears in the prophetic vision, as in a hollow, vacated space filled with a fine light that we call the residue. This is the place in which all the created worlds will stand, as I have explained. And this was opening 26, and from what I can remember, I would say this is the longest opening. In 26 it would make sense because it's the Shem Havaya.